It's now 7:03. Should we go for just half an hour? Should we go for an hour?
First questions about Surah Al-Humazah. First questions related to the tafsir.
I had two. One was I was wondering what the occasion for this surah was, like what exactly happened, or what did the Muslims experience, or would the Prophet see that occasion this revelation?
Yeah. There is a considerable amount of disagreement about whether this was a revelation with an occasion. Some have said that it was revealed in response to Walid ibn al-Mughira, who was among the aristocracy in Mecca, and who was known for his wealth and known for his arrogance, known for his slaves. He had a lot of slaves, and also known for persecuting Muslims. But what's really interesting so the reports that come from the Hadith tradition said, here's a list of names that possibly this could have been describing. Ubay bin Khalaf, Ammar said this. Jamil bin Amir al-Jumahi, Mujahid said this. Al-Akhnas bin Shurayq al-Thaqafi, al-Suddi said this. And Ibn Jurayh is the one who said it was revealed about Walid ibn Mughira. But قول الأكثرين, the majority view, or the majority of scholars said, إنها مرسلة على العموم من غير تخصيص, that it has no occasion for revelation, that it was a revelation on the moral condition. I have, in the past, this was years ago, I've looked at the traditions by Ammar and Mujahid and Suddi and Ibn Jurayh, and all the reports that it refers to Walid ibn Mughira or Akhnas ibn Shurayq or Ibn Amir or Ibn bin Khalaf, Ubay bin Khalaf, are unreliable. They're speculative. In other words, they're deductive from the early generation of commentators in the 2nd century, where they say it must have been about this person or that person, but there's nothing reliable. And I think the majority position that it is without an occasion is correct. That's a good question. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned that there was other ayahs in the Quran that Allah talks sarcastically, and you said there were books in Arabic. I'm just curious what the books are.
Yeah, there is a PhD dissertation that was written in the 70s. I think it was 76 or 78. It's one of these 2 years. And it's called أسلوب السخرية البلاغية أسلوب السخرية البلاغية في القرآن. That's the main one that I had in mind. There are a number of other PhD dissertations. The ones that I know are all Azhari, that have a chapter on a Sukhriya Quran, and they're all on al-Balagha of Quran. They're all under the general rubric of Balagha of Quran, and then they have a chapter normally or a section.
Thank you.
Does the hutama will only be given for someone who has the personality that likes to amass wealth and just counting out their money every time, admiring it?
No, الحطمة, what we will translate as the crusher, but it is this discombobulating and the deconstructing of the ego. It's actually the same meaning features in several parts of the Quran. So meaning the point is that the nature of Jahannam, that nature is that it will be it will deconstruct egos. It will break down every egotistical attitude accompanied by injustice. You do have some, the Sufis talk about whether egos not accompanied by injustice. In other words, people who were egotistical but they didn't. Ibn Arabi says it's impossible that egoism always is accompanied by injustice. Ibn Arabi thinks it's impossible for egoism to exist without injustice. Allahu Alam. But the point is that description of Jahannam, you can generalize it as to the state of being. Jahannam, that God's punishment in the hereafter will not allow arrogance to stand without response. My teachers, and I've said this before, and I've actually said it to you if you hear back the Halaqas that I gave 20 years ago. I used to talk about this much more. We were taught that the vast majority of sin starts with an egotistical state. That the key to taqwa is to confront and to control your ego. And so the emphasis in building a Muslim character which is equal to a virtuous character was to first and foremost to confront your ego and our tendency towards arrogance. We're driven towards arrogance because of the divine part in us. The only one, we were taught, the only one that can handle arrogance without injustice is Allah. Everyone other than Allah cannot handle arrogance. The arrogance will inevitably draw them to minimizing the rights of others and aggrandizing their own rights. They will always understate the suffering of others and overstate their own sense of being wronged, and it is what I remember how we would go through exercises of practicing empathy. I mean, I'm always amazed, and it made me admire the old school, I have to say, because in the modern methods of pedagogy, we don't do any of that. I mean, but the old methods of pedagogy, when you are asked to sit there and to think to articulate the virtues of your mother, or the virtues of your father, or the virtues of your sister, the virtues of your brother, and all the ways that they are right and you are wrong, and to do the exercise over and over and over, and then to do it with neighbors, and then to do it, and it was very healthy. At first it felt weird, but ultimately it was very healthy, because then you really would start noticing eventually how you tend to see everything from your own perspective, and you project onto others whatever is convenient for you, and you assume things, and that if you're very honest, you catch yourself falling in these contradictions, which is the heart of hypocrisy. Hassan Abdul Ghani, Allah yarhamu, one of my teachers, wrote a really good book that he used to have halaqas on, called Al-Munafiqun wa Shu'ab al-Nifaq, which talks about how the mechanics of catching yourself, catching hypocrisy within the self, and the nature of hypocrisy within the sense is a contradiction. That what you condemn others for at one point, you forgive yourself for at another point. And what you forgive yourself for at one point, you condemn others for at another point. And that's the heart of hypocrisy.
What's the difference between pride and arrogance? Or is there a difference?
The interesting thing is in Arabic, there is no singular word for pride. There is two words for confidence, al-thiqa bin-nafs, or al-thiqa. So, interesting that in Arabic the dichotomy is between confidence and arrogance, and which is more just than pride and arrogance, because in Kierkegaard, when he looked at, he writes about Kierkegaard and Jung, these two. They talked a lot about pride and its relationship to the ego, and Jung and Kierkegaard, unlike Freud, didn't see the ego as playing a healthy part, but actually saw it as often a mechanism and a tool for arrogance and so on. And often when you read this material, you think to yourself, if English had the dichotomy between confidence and arrogance, it would have been epistemologically far more workable than the dichotomy between pride and arrogance. But generally speaking, when we say pride that is acceptable, it's usually in the sense of confidence, that you deal with yourself justly. You are not unjust to yourself, and you know your worth. Arrogance is when you forgive and ignore your moral faults, even when you are inflicting injustice against others. God, and this is another, inshallah, hopefully we'll get to that, but Allah's forgiveness when it comes to the rights of other human beings is contingent on the forgiveness of other human beings. Among the disasters of Wahhabi school is that they convince Muslims that you can go to Hajj and even the injustices you've committed against other human beings will be just forgiven and erased, and that's a modern thing. The injustices you commit against other human beings, ultimately God has the power to forgive if the other human beings stingily or unreasonably do not extend forgiveness, but they are the possessor of prime rights. And this is an important point, because if you are unjust towards other human beings, if you're unjust towards yourself or unjust towards God, then that's up to God to forgive without any impediments. But if you are unjust towards other human beings, making amends is a very serious theological endeavor. The whole process of tawbah and how to undertake tawbah by making amends. There's just so much about that, and inshallah we'll get to the parts of the Quran that talk about.
Sorry, what's Tawbah?
Tawbah is the process of atonement. So atoning for your sins. It is not always possible to address the rights of other human beings. So sometimes we do everything in our ability to atone and beg God to make these human beings whole and to forgive us anyway. But if those who read Arabic, you can read some. I actually mentioned it in Search for Beauty in one of the chapters. Ibn Arabi in Ahkam al-Quran has a really nice discussion about this. That the presumption always has to be that if the atonement is contingent on making amends towards other human beings and the injustices that you've committed.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hadi, question about the part where you mentioned about secular versus religious morality, specifically the difference between reward and punishment-based accountability. Shouldn't seekers perform moral acts for the sake of its intrinsic value of beauty and virtue, and not for reward or punishment? He's reminded of the story of Rabi al-Adawiyya running with fire. I guess the poem about her burning down the gates of fire.
Yeah. No, there is a difference here, and it's a little bit subtle. When we say philosophically morality doesn't cohere without punishment and reward in the hereafter, it goes back to this question of what is the source of obligation, the taklif, the source of the philosophical source of obligation. Now, if we think just philosophically, we can say, okay, well, obligation can be because it derives from a higher moral principle. Like, for instance, all obligations derive from the moral principle of do unto others like you want done unto you. But then, of course, that begs the question of, well, what is the source of that broad norm? What is the source of that prior obligation? And then we get to the ultimate question of origins, the philosophical question of origins. And here, you either say, well, it originates in something innate, like nature, or it originates in a theoretical, hypothetical covenant that has social contract between human beings. In other words, it originates in a closed philosophical circle. Or you'd say, well, it originates because of something outside that closed philosophical circle that created the obligation in the first place, that created the very, very a priori obligation. And that's the big philosophical debate. between the secular and non-secular. Now, this is separate from the question of, is it a virtue to reach a level of moral consciousness where you no longer covet the reward or fear the punishment? In other words, it's like, and this goes back to Rab'a actually, that you fell in love with the philosophical origin, the creator of the obligation, and achieved such a unity of being, such a wahda, that your impulses have become one and the same with the Maker, the Divine Lord. And that is, ultimately when the people like Ibn Arabi or Shilani when they talk about wahdat al-wujud and al-ittihad and so on, they talk about that you elevate yourself morally to the point that your impulses become according to the Creator. So you become one and the same. But this requires it requires a complete abolition of ego. Because if you have any ounce of ego, then your impulses cannot be one and the same with the Creator. Which even Rab'a or any or Rumi or Hafiz or any of them would say it's the rare exception. Only very few people are able to achieve that. And they do not deny that philosophically that the obligation itself needs to be from a creator, because they do not deny the necessity of a creator. In fact, they embrace it. But what they're saying is that you should become so virtuous that you don't become a god, but that you dilute yourself into God. And that's an argument about virtue ethics, not about philosophical roots. And so, yeah, it is a moral virtue, but it is also, the warning is those who, without having gone through the process of evisceration of ego, their ego is this big, and they say, oh, we don't think about hellfire and reward or punishment. But you're all about your ego. I mean, so effectively what you're saying is, we don't care about rewards, but we worship ourselves. And the whole, when Allah describes the nature of the message of Abraham, onwards to all the prophets, is one of Islam. It's that it is not possible to break the cycle of self-idolatry without first the act of submission to God. And when you mentioned Alcoholic Anonymous and so on, I mean, what always amazes me is that when I read this literature, it starts out with, you cannot defeat the boogeyman of addiction, the monster of addiction, without first acknowledging your submission to a higher being. And that just is mind-blowing, because it's like what we have been saying all along, what the entire message of Islam is all along. And one other thing is that when I see what has come out of philosophical self-idolatry, including the neocons or the right-wing capitalists, the ideology of capitalism or fascism and so on, the whole point of human being as basically the end-all and the God, the Godhead, or Ian, what's her name? Ian Rand, and her book The Fountainhead and all that was on. It speaks volumes. I mean, subhanAllah, when I engage the folks from the Federalist Society, it's literally as if the Quran is describing their white privilege and their arrogance and their sense of entitlement. The way they look at the world was just from the tip of their nose, and everyone is beneath them, and the suffering of others doesn't count unless they're from their own little privileged background. A good threatening fire would do them a lot of good.
I had two questions. I hope one is brief. I was wondering, in this surah, Allah uses the term afida for hearts, and I was wondering, is there a particular reason why that word is chosen for hearts? Because I know in Arabic there's a bunch of words for heart, and I was wondering if there's a specific reason for that word.
Yeah, there is. The fu'ad, okay, there are, it's one of the very fascinating things. You know how semiology and semiotics and study of language can tell you a lot about the culture if you study the language, and how many words for something can tell you an amazing, great deal. Well, one of the things about Arabic is the number of words that refer to the heart, and that's because of the role of romanticism and the spirit in Arabic language. But anyway, so there is muhja, which could refer to the heart in the sense of essence. There's qalb, which could refer to the heart in the sense of a source of being, in a more physical sense. And then fu'ad. Fu'ad could refer to the heart in the sense of the soul, and af'ida, especially when it's used in the plural, could refer to the soul of the being, or could refer to the internal organs. So af'ida could actually mean internal organs, and that is why in the first layer of meaning, when it said تَطَّلِعُ عَلَى الْأَفْئِدَةِ, the literalist said it means that the fire will penetrate through the skin and reach the organs. So it's a very straightforward literal meaning. The second layer of interpretation, said no, the fire penetrates through the surface and reaches the spirit, the collective souls. It wouldn't. The other thing, notice that if you said تطلع على القلوب, the meaning would change completely. Because then, if you say تطلع على القلوب, it would mean it will know the secrets of people. So the choice of word here is significant. تطلع على القلوب means that you know what people are hiding inside of their hearts. It wouldn't have that literal meaning of actually reaching within the self. If you say تطلع على المهج, muhja, that would then mean it will know the secret longings of people. So تطلع على الأفئدة is typical of the Quran. You can't replace it with any other word and get the same meaning.
Sure.
That was my question, actually.
Okay.
That was
Sorry,
your question?
Olsen, you had a second question.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, so you talked about arrogance as a failure to ignore one's own moral failings. So does that mean that humility is the ability to recognize your own moral failings? And the reason why I ask this is because one of my favorite poems is T.S. Eliot, and he has a line that says, "Humility is endless." And so, is the Muslim understanding then that humility is just the ability to recognize one's own moral failings?
No, humility, I think if you would have asked any either my teachers or any of this, like even someone like Khaled Abou El Fadl, or asked any of the mystical interpreters, commentators on the Quran, I think all of them would say humility is endless. It just, and I agree with that. It begins with recognizing your own moral failings. It's a necessary condition. If you don't see yourself with transparency, it's not only that humility is not possible, but even love is not possible. Because when we love, we most often we project ourselves onto the other person, and then quite often what we are really loving is we love ourselves, and we're just projecting ourselves onto the other person, and then the person that is the object of our love feels confused and unloved eventually because they discover that you actually don't know them. Humility is a necessary, seeing yourself with transparency is a necessary condition for so many of the virtues of life. But the reason humility is endless is that in the same way that is it possible in this nice debate that they used to have, can you reach a point, this is they usually have this debate about Al-Hallaj. Was Hallaj ultimately wrong when he said لَيْسَ فِي جُبَّتِي إِلَّا اللَّهِ, that there's nothing inside of me except Allah? Can a seeker truly think that they have reached a point where they've diluted themselves entirely and so thoroughly that their journey with humility is done? Because now they've become one and completely emasculated in Allah. And what's fascinating is that even the most ecstatic of them, like Rabbi al-Adawiyya and so on, would still say, I am not saying that that I've reached the end of the journey, and that the journey does have an end. And that's why in her poetry, when she says that حيائي حيائي منك يبعدني وداع الشوق يدعوني, that even her relationship with Allah is like it contracts and retracts. It's back and forth. She's able to come closer at times and drifts away at times, and so there is no end to the journey of humility. I would completely agree with that. It is endless. Any other questions about Surah Al-Humazah?
Do you want to tackle just a couple from the non-surah? What about Hajj? And the one about India? The next one to do that.
I mean, these are the questions Grace are referring to. I have a question about some scholars, most notably from Tunisia, said that Muslims should not go to Hajj as long as Saudi Arabia is committing the atrocities that Saudi Arabia is committing in Yemen. And so someone, or not, I mean, several people have written asking me about that. And then there's a question from India that a group Hindu extremists had slaughtered about 70 Muslims. And as a response, Muslims were protesting the massacre of the 70 by praying in public spaces. And there was a man who was Hindu who converted to Islam, who passed away, and then his family insisted that he would be given a Hindu burial and not a Muslim burial, so they burned his corpse. And the question was, is it lawful to do salat al-janazah, salat al-mayyit, on someone who was given a Hindu burial instead of a Muslim burial? And according to the question, that they wanted the response because it affects the way that they organize their protests. For me, because I know that especially the folks in India, there's some urgency because apparently these protests are going on, or they're waiting. First, I want to say that one thing is clear, and there is no. I mean, we can say with a very high level of confidence that Salat al-Janazah is performed according to the intention of the deceased, not the dispensation of the physical body of the deceased. So, an unjust ruler could execute a Muslim, because this has happened in human history, in Muslim history, and then order Muslims not to perform Salat al-Janazah or funeral prayer. It's not only you don't have to obey, but you should not obey, and you should do the Salat al-Janazah anyway, because the person who died as a Muslim. Similarly, people could die, the physical body could disappear. So we have people who drown in an ocean, we never retrieve their physical body. We have people who die in avalanches, we never retrieve their physical body. And yet we do the funeral prayer according to intentionality because they died with the intention of being a Muslim. And so the dispensation, whatever happens to the physical body, is irrelevant to the decision to do Salat al-Janazah. So the fact that this brother converted to Islam, died, and then his family, which is Hindu, took his body and incinerated it rather than buried it, is irrelevant for the purposes of doing Salat al-Janazah. You perform Salat al-Janazah on him as if because he was a Muslim and he died with the Shahada, and whatever happened to his body is entirely irrelevant. As to a prayer as a form of protest, this is also a question that we can answer with a very high level of confidence. Very recently, in the Arab Spring, prayers in Tunisia and in Egypt and in Syria, the protesters were often start praying as a form of protest. And actually one of the very shameful things that in which you was very revealing as to the natures of the governments that were confronting them is that they were frequently attacked while in prayer, because in Islamic theology, prayer has a sanctity. And if people are praying, by the way, whether they're Muslim or not, so you cannot even attack a Christian in prayer or a Jew in prayer. And there is some very fascinating material about the law of war in that. I mean, if you lay siege to a fort, and then once you enter it, you find people are in prayer, you have to wait for them until they're done with prayer, and you can't attack them. So declaring prayer as a form of creating space to call upon the conscience of people, to say, stop the bloodshed, think about what you're doing, is a very deeply rooted tradition, and especially in the Islamic civilization. And one of the signs of deterioration of modern Islam is the refusal to recognize the sanctity of prayer and attacking people who are in prayer, as we saw in the Arab Spring, unfortunately. So anyone that tells you, no, you shouldn't use prayer as a protest, it's not based on anything in jurisprudence or in the mechanics of Sharia. When you are praying, you're truly supplicating to God to guide people to something that is more moral and more virtuous than slaughter. So in other words, those people who slaughtered the 70 Muslims, it's as if you're supplicating God, and at the same time you're reminding them that honor the space of divinity. And it's a dignified and elevated means of protest. And since I received that, the message was quite long. It was a very long letter by the folks organizing the protests and so on. I have been praying for you. And they, part of the letter, they say that because of the rising Islamophobia, even in India, and responding to Islamophobia with prayer is a very elevated and dignified and virtuous and Islamic way of protesting. And may Allah be with you, and may Allah aid you and support you, and lift your hardships, inshallah. Let's postpone the Hajj one, because that one will take more unpacking. And I can't just say yes and no without explaining why I say what I say.
It's 7:46 now, isn't it? It's a good time to end here. Okay.
Yeah,
This is kind of a loaded question, so it's up to you whether you want to answer or not, but considering the recent Supreme Court case, or not the case, but with Dr. Ford testifying against Bert Kavanaugh for the seat of the Supreme Court Justice, and concerning Imam Zaid Shakir's initial Facebook post in which he stated that Islamically Dr. Ford's testimony is not evidence enough of sexual assault, and he also analogized sexual assault to zina. What in the Sharia and Islamic system, what constitutes evidence in the case of sexual assault? What constitutes evidence? Is testimony not enough? Do they need like eyewitnesses? And given in the modern age we have digital records, photography, videotapes. So yeah, my question is what constitutes?
The reason I'm smiling is that we actually started the Halaqa talking about this, but the part we didn't talk about is what does constitute evidence for sexual assault. The law of zina and the law of slander is within the purview of hudud. Hudud means that the rights of God are mixed with the rights of human beings, but the rights of God, it's as if they are areas where God had addressed specifically and created space for them specifically. So the law of 4 witnesses and the law of oath, li'an, oath and counter oath. Number one, had never applies outside a Muslim polity. So to say, to come up with the law of 4 witnesses in a non-Muslim polity is absolute nonsense.
What's that like?
Had is hudud, the hudud punishments,
Capital.
the ones that were addressed specifically by God so they are zina, drinking alcohol, slander, theft, stealing, robbery, stealing, and then apostasy and hiraba are 2 debated ones. The hiraba in Rebellion book I talk about those who said that this is had and those who said it's not, and apostasy again because it is premised on what the jurisprudence of Abu Bakr, not on the Quranic text. But the ones that we all recognize are zina, slander, drinking alcohol, and stealing.
Zina is adultery.
Adultery.
One of the English is.
Yeah. No, it's good that you always make me. So anyway, but when it comes especially to the law of slander and 4 witnesses, it's a had. وَلَا يُقَاسُ عَلَى حَد. You can't extend the law by analogy on the basis of a had. A had is like something that God bracketed it, and I'll tell you precisely why. It's because God doesn't care about the enforcement of the punishment, but cares about the moral lesson to be extracted from the punishment. So it's a very old medieval way of articulating law, where you enunciate a very severe punishment, but you make the application of the punishment impossible. And the point is that you want to communicate a moral lesson. But in jurisprudence, until the Wahhabis came along, the principle was لا يقاس على حد. You can't extend the law from had to a derivative law because what was enunciated through the rules of evidence of Allah cannot be extended. And what is remarkable is the ones from the medieval age, the ones who initiated the debate about, in Islamic jurisprudence, about rape and the difference between rape and fornication and adultery. First, it started with the Maliki jurists. And there was a very famous fatwa by Ibn Rushd, the grandfather, not the philosopher, where there were a group of people who broke into a home. They went after they stole stuff. They raped a woman in there, and Ibn Rushd refused to said to require 4 witnesses. Something like that it is completely makes absolutely no sense, and ruled that either testimony or circumstantial evidence would be enough to establish the case. So he took, including the witnesses of people positioned to witness the events. In other words, so if the only people positioned to witness the events were victims of the crime, normally in Islamic law we don't take the testimony of the witnesses of the crime for the purposes of establishing a fact. But Ibn Rushd said that when it comes to crimes like that, crimes involving assault and victimization and preying on the vulnerabilities of people, then the testimony of the victim of the crime, in fact, must be taken. Now, we know from al-Bayan wa Tahsil that initially there was controversy in that some resisted Ibn Rushd's fatwa, but I have found in Kitab al-Asl by Shaybani, which is a Hanafi text, which is centuries before Ibn Rushd, I actually found the same fatwa already in a Hanafi source, in Kitab al-Asl by Shaybani, centuries earlier. But what becomes, to make a longer story short, that what becomes accepted as the Islamic civilization moves from tribalism to urbanism, because in tribal society you can control crime fairly well just through tribal ties, and if a crime occurs through tribal connections, you could pretty much know who's doing what, and you don't lose track of anyone. But as Muslims increasingly move to urban realities and the realities of moving and shifting populations where faces are changing all the time, is that circumstantial evidence was accepted contrary to what Orientalists say, and the testimony of victims became, and rape was seen increasingly as a crime of haraba, brigandish, as a form of terrorism. And so in my rebellion book, I talk, towards the end of the book, I talk a great deal about how Muslim jurists applied the rules of evidence, not just from the Maliki school, but even Hanafis and Shafi'is and even Hanbalis, applied the same rules of evidence, which were very exploratory and investigative in nature. And that is why when modernity started coming in, Muslim jurists, whether from Azhar or Qarawin in Morocco, or in the jurists of West Africa, or the jurists of India, it was a non-issue for them, had no difficulty initially applying the principle of circumstantial evidence to crimes, what they used to call crimes of honor, jara'im al-sharaf. And what's interesting is that, again, it always does go back to this. We saw the retreat from the initial response to modernity with the rise of Wahhabi slash Salafi, where we started, and particularly so you take someone in Saudi Arabia, since I've read a lot of criminal law, Saudi criminal law, one of the most amazing things to me is that you find all these cases that you find a man and woman sitting in a car. You convict them 6 months in prison, a year in prison, and 100 lashes or 300 lashes. And then a woman comes and says, this man raped me. You say, well, you don't have 4 witnesses. And in fact, there were a lot of cases in which the woman is sentenced to lashes for accusing the man. Now, again, Allah gave us brains, right? You take any group of human beings and you replace that woman with your sister, your mother, your daughter, and the sense of offense will be universal. And in fact, I'll tell you, if that is Islam, a lot of people say we don't want Islam. Most decent human beings will say, if you're gonna, any woman that comes forward that says, my, all these poor servant girls that work in homes, and then they have their employer, from Bangladesh and India and Pakistan and so on, they sneak into their bedrooms at night and sexually abuse them, and then in all these cases we read that even the sexual abuses posted on the net in some websites. I mean, so it's there. And that's how wives usually find out, or they find out. And yet, complete immunity. Someone wants to tell me that's Islam? Impossible. No God worthy of worship would legitimate or accept these egregious injustices. And a proper system of justice, Sharia, which is based on the notion of justice, would always premise itself on how to bring an end to evil. That type of evil, which one of the, you asked a question that just touches upon all the sore points, because I teach human trafficking and one of the things that really, do you know that when I first learned that, I went into serious depression. That now a constant item in pornographic sites is Islamic themes or Arab themes. I have no idea. And then when I read that most of this stuff is premised on the sexual abuse of domestic workers and poor women from. I mean, if you have, as a Muslim, that should make your blood boil to no end. I mean, if it's happening at that scale, women who, the only reason they go work in homes of men, and they're away from their husbands and from their fathers and from their brothers is because they're poor. And they go work in these, and then they become somehow. It's shocking. It's endless. So when I saw that fatwa that you're referring to, immediately what enraged me is because it's all connected. When you say that about a situation like this in the U.S., a good jurist, leave alone a conscientious human being, would immediately think about the implications of what you're saying for all these thousands upon thousands of poor, abused women who are victimized by the same jargon and have to suffer sexual abuse and keep their mouth shut because they can't get 4 witnesses, and if they go to the police station, they'll get punished. And how could this happen in Muslim lands? Even the fact that the evidence is right there on the net, and then when you talk to these, what do I call them? And they tell you, oh, but that's not evidence in Sharia, brother. You know that? Then you don't call me brother. I'm not your brother. If you accept this with a straight face, it's horrific. It's horrific, and feeding into the apologetics that empowers these institutions is no less horrific. And any Muslim from our parts of the world would have heard stories of what's going on, because it is so systematic and widespread. It's terrifying. I mean, how can, in the human trafficking reports, how can Muslim countries be among the highest ranked human trafficking abusers, and we sit there and talk about Sharia requiring 4 witnesses? Astaghfirullah. I mean, because there I, when you find that type of stuff coming from Saudi Arabia, you understand the patriarchal and the elitist and the corruptions of privilege. But when you find it coming out of American Muslims, then freedom and liberty and education didn't elevate you. And that's very depressing. You know, I might excuse you if you're back home and you're oppressed, because if you say anything else, you go to prison. Because that's what happens in Saudi Arabia. If you disagree, they throw you in prison, as happened to several respectable jurists. But what is your excuse if you're in the U.S. and you say stuff like that? Yeah, this is what we started the Halaqa with. So.
You guys should go back and listen to. 'Cause
Yeah, sorry.
he said a lot.
Sorry, yeah, we were.
I had a class.
That's okay.
But yeah, thank you for answering the question on what constitutes evidence against sexual assault.
Where there's a precedent for circumstantial
Yeah.
evidence. Because I didn't even. I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. It is circumstantial evidence, and it is because sexual assault. Well, if you're going to apply a capital punishment, then the majority said that you need capital punishment, meaning death.
Yeah.
And then the majority said you need 2 witnesses for it. But anything short of capital punishment, all the ta'zir, imprisonment, banishment, and flogging, or of course, we don't do flogging in the modern age, or we shouldn't. But then including the testimony of the victim would be sufficient for the punishment. I mean, it is. If you read in Kutub al-Qada, you'll find a lot being written about that you should seek collaborating circumstantial evidence. So, injuries, bruises, broken pottery. I mean, that's examples you usually give.
Multiple women.
Cumulative testimony of multiple victims and so on. And even in cumulative testimony, because there was a ayar, or sometimes called the shuttar, but usually the ayar. Ayar is a repeat offender who is sort of repeatedly harassing women or sexually assaulting women or even possibly men. And with these people, you can take the seerah. You can actually go and just collect the cumulative testimonies of various victims that suffered from this person. And then as a result, banish them or imprison them and so on and so forth. But yeah, I just nothing really gets under my skin, especially with the problem, the enormous problem of human trafficking, including human trafficking committed by Muslims, which the way that this foreign witnesses thing feeds into the human trafficking industry is enraging, because that's not what the point of. The idea was to protect the honor of women from slander. Saying don't slander a woman unless you have witnesses. And then we took it and we flipped it on its head, and then ended up victimizing women with it. This is disgusting. Okay?
On that happy note.
On that happy note.
Alhamdulillah, thank you.
Alhamdulillah.